Kane, as is clear from what everyone has said, was a great teacher, a wonderfully imaginative historian, and a committed public individual, intellectual citizen of India. As a public intellectual, he wrote extensively on communalism and its dangers, participated in anti-communal movements, organizing anti-communal associations. He was active with SAMAT, very active with SAMAT, and he helped establish the Kerala Council for Historical Research, which has already been mentioned, and a host of other associations. I will not go into his role as a public intellectual. I'll focus on his oeuvre of historical work and the kind of ideas that he threw up in the writings that are available to us. I have always tracked his writings very carefully, read them because they are close to my own interests, and I began following his ideas and writings while I was a student here, and he was my teacher. Kane, as has been mentioned again, had three broad areas of interest. One was diplomacy, which was actually his PhD thesis, which he published subsequently. The second was agrarian relations and Malabar movement, peasant movements in Malabar. And the third was culture, colonial culture and intellectual history over time. Now, I think if you look at his writings, in all these spheres, not so much on diplomacy because that he gave up, but in his writings on agrarian relations and in culture, his ideas, like the ideas of all creative intellectuals, changed over time. He innovatively integrated all the debates and discussions, connected to the existing critical traditions, and integrated what he thought is important in his own framework of Marxism. As a consequence, his Marxism itself changed over time. I begin with a few comments on his writing on agrarian history. Consider the first essay that he ever wrote, which we all excitedly heard in Teen Murti when he presented it in 1978, and which was subsequently published, the essay on Malabar rebellions, peasant rebellions in Malabar in the 19th and 20th century. It was published in A.R. Desai's Peasant Movements, Peasant Struggles in India. Now, Kane's object in that essay was to critique British official accounts of the Malabar rebellion, Mappila rebellion, and also Stephen Dale's argument that the Mappila rebellion was a religious war, where Muslim tenantry rebelled against Hindu Janmi landlords. Kane powerfully argued against this simplistic framework. And his effort was to show that there is a wider basis of agrarian rebellion, there was a wider agrarian unrest, and the tenantry had reasons, agrarian reasons, economic reasons, to rebel against Hindu landlords. In that argument, in that particular essay, which was very inspiring for the time it was published, his argument was one where he looked at religion as something which the interested people mechanically and instrumentally used in order to mobilize the peasants who were actually rebelling on an agrarian cause, who had economic basis for agrarian opposition. In some sense, if you look at the argument, this argument fitted in very neatly with the Marxism of a particular variety of that time. And my argument would be that Kane, without recognizing it publicly, actually slowly developed a critique of it, negotiated this Marxism, and made his own argument much more complex over time. Over time, he realized, if you see his own writing over time in the 80s, he realized that his reading of religion was extremely reductive and instrumentalist. It was not doing justice to the power of religion in public culture, within the peasantry, how it gripped their mind of the peasants within that region. His analysis of agrarian distress remained. But by the time he published his book, I think it's 88, 89, he published his book, Against Lord and State. In that, religion acquired a completely different life. It was a radical break with his own argument, and he acknowledges it in the introduction but does not elaborate on it. Their religion in everyday life is the object of his analysis. He talks of religion as something which is so pervasive that it is peasants could not think of the world, think of relating to the world, think of their objects of attack, critique, or movements without using the language of religion of the everyday life, which was taken for granted. That was part of their common sense. So it's not a question of somebody using religion to mobilize them. That's the way they thought. That's the way they related to the world. And that's the way they related to, saw their landlords and others. In this argument that he's developing, he also saw the religious leaders in a completely different way. Earlier, he saw the religious leaders as interested people who were somehow manipulating the peasants against the landlords. But now he began to see them as innovative, creative intellectuals. He refers to them as traditional intellectuals in the language of Gramsci, where he makes a difference between traditional and organic intellectuals and other intellectuals, where they are traditional intellectuals who have the power, who have a relationship with the peasantry, whose relationship is mediated by religion, and they reinterpreted religion innovatively to mobilize the peasants. They reinnovated the idea of becoming shaheed, they reinterpreted the idea of jihad, and rebellion against death in the agrarian struggle was seen as a legitimate basis of becoming a shaheed. So attack against the landlords was something which they legitimated through the language of religion itself. And they were therefore not just doing it for themselves, they were doing it for the sake of the movement and there. He reinterpreted the spaces of religion, the various kinds of spaces that was there, whether it is religious spaces in the mosque or other congregational spaces, as spaces of sociality, as spaces where intellectuals and leaders met the peasantry. There were spaces where people came together, planned their attack against the landlords, and that's the places which were organizational centers of religion. So in a variety of different ways, he was rethinking the spaces of religion, the institutions of religion, the leaders who were part of this religious practice, the language of religion, the grammar of religion, to think about the character of rebellion as such. And I think it's very innovatively done and a radical rethinking of his own ideas, where culture now is seen much more as constitutive, as having a role in a way where it is not an option between religion, culture, religion versus economy. Economy is still critical for him, but the culture also becomes constitutive along with the agrarian causes of the revolt. So the argument that tradition provided the resources for the rebellion, for the language of rebellion, is something which you see in his writings on culture too, where culture is constantly being seen as the space and the site for negotiation with the world. I'll just say one or two things about his writing, how it changes over time, how it deepens over time on the question of culture. When he taught us 1976, could I just have my water? When he taught us in 1976, he was teaching a course on intellectual history of India. He was teaching a course on intellectual history of India, and his argument was the following, that within the colonial context, it was not easy for thinkers to formulate radical ideas and carry through radical reforms. So we see their ideas marked by a certain ambivalence, and this was a critical word in his argument, and it is there was a hesitation in carrying through radical formulations, and we see also at the same time a backsliding, retreat from radicalism. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the early phase is different from Raja Ram Mohan Roy in the later phase. Vidyasagar in his early phase is different from Vidyasagar when he begins to transform his ideas into reform agendas. So in interaction with society, people, the reformers had to change their ideas and retreat. Now, therefore, this argument meant that in his framework, audience mattered, reception mattered, how people were accepting the argument or not accepting, resisting or not resisting, those things mattered. And this was very, very significant in framing an idea of cultural history. These arguments are developed further in the subsequent articles and books that he wrote over a period of time, published in the early 90s and through the 90s, Culture, Ideology and Hegemony, Colonialism, Culture and Resistance, a collection of essays that we see. If you look at the essays, he's developing and nuancing this argument that he was developing in the 70s. He's arguing that in the colonial context, intellectuals were confronted with a paradox. And his essays are an analysis of that paradox. Intellectuals are confronted with the conflicting need to relate to tradition on the one hand and Western culture in the. They could neither reject tradition nor appropriate it fully. They could neither reject the Western culture nor accept it fully. And this process of negotiation with Western culture, with tradition, is what defined the nature of reform. And this defined the nature of all the cultural events that were taking place. He analyzes, for instance, that famous essay on the shoe question that he analyzes, or his analysis of the Indulekha, of the novel Indulekha, or his analysis of the indigenous medicines that he analyzes. Everywhere you see this negotiation going on. The argument is not a full rejection of West, but never an acceptance of Western idealism. So his argument is that it is not nationalism versus colonialism that is played out, it is something different, where it is a creative negotiation with the tradition as well as the modern, with the past as well as the present. And we need to look at culture as a site of struggle, a site which is being colonized by colonialism, and which in many creative, innovative and heterogeneous ways, Indian intellectuals and Indians are negotiating to produce new kind of solutions to the problems that they confronted in everyday life. So I'd suggest that Keynes' writings on agrarian rebellion that we see in the 80s, late 80s, was profoundly influenced by his own exploration of culture. And this exploration of culture is what we see nuancing his argument about agrarian rebellion. So the difference we see between his early writings on agrarian rebellion and the later writing is something which is mediated by his studies on culture. Personally, I have gained enormously from reading Keynes' writings and from my associations with him and intellectual friendship with him, first as a student and then as a colleague. I'll remember him with the warmest respect.